No trips to the moon today, but instead a very down-to-earth discussion on UK space policy at a critical time and an exciting time in the global space race. So we are delighted to organize this event with Inmarsat, the world's largest satellite operator. We launched the Space Policy Unit in April this year. It is the only one of its kind in Westminster, which tells you something about how little space has registered politically in Westminster until now. We look to change that, and our mission is to argue for a new level of ambition for Britain in space. We've actually published a space manifesto, which I think you can find copies at the back. And I encourage you to have a look at that. It's also on our website. It seems that the Prime Minister might have had a look at it because he almost quoted word for word from it in his first speech as Prime Minister on the steps of Downing Street when he said, when he called for Britain to have, our own positioning, navigation, and timing and Earth observation satellite systems, which was a big deal for the industry to hear a Prime Minister say that. So space is clearly on Boris Johnson's agenda, but there are many things to address in this area, and we are here to discuss some of the more salient and urgent ones. We've got an exceptional panel for this space mission, starting with the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Oliver Dowden, MP. And you'll see why this is a key role for what we hope to see being implemented in space in the months ahead. And then we will also have Lord Willetts, who's a bit late. He'll join us around 10 o'clock. We have Ian Taylor from Inmarsat, former Minister for Science and Technology. And Lucy Edge from the Satellite Applications Catapult, Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer. And I'm also pleased to recognize in the audience Stuart Martin, who's the CEO of the Satellite Application Catapult. Thank you for coming. So we'll have some introductory remarks, some discussion after that, and then we'll open up for questions. So let's take off, and the launch pad is yours, Minister.
Well, thank you for giving me the launch pad. I suppose I should start off by explaining why I'm sitting at the launch pad. And it's actually a curious function of the Cabinet Office. For those of you, and I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the Cabinet Office, but often when I say I'm Minister of the Cabinet Office, people's first question is, what is the Cabinet Office? So the Cabinet Office is essentially the closest thing we have in government to an HQ. The idea is that we work on issues that cut across different government departments to create a coordinated and effective single government response, working very closely with the Treasury and 10 Downing Street. And that ranges all the way through from national security and critical national infrastructure and civil contingency and resilience through to driving domestic implementation across the government's key priorities, through to transforming government, so moving from individual government departments dealing with issues such as property, commercial and digital transformation, and taking a whole government approach. So really, as Minister for the Cabinet Office, my interest in this is that it cuts across more than one government department. So whilst clearly BEIS is one of the lead government departments on it, Cabinet Office has an interest cutting across those different areas of government activity. And I'm glad that you started by quoting the Prime Minister on this. Often when one comes to speak on these panels, the first word you say is, this is a terribly important area. But genuinely, this is a very important area, and its importance is indicated by the words that the Prime Minister used, but also just looking at the facts of it. We've got a highly skilled, highly productive industry that's already worth £148 billion. And I really think that there is huge potential for the UK to develop this further. If we get the right structures, we get the right frameworks in place, we can enable this industry and the wider academic underpinning of it to thrive. So that's why we've been very clear as a government that the UK is not going to and must not sit out the space race. And I think there's a number of reasons for that beyond it. First of all, we are highly dependent on space, whether that's for communications, Earth observation, space weather forecasting, position and navigation and timing signals for military and critical national infrastructure. But also space is increasingly becoming very congested and contested. So this is another reason why there needs to be effective government action in this space. It's worth noting that reduced launch costs and small satellite technology has opened the domain to more and more both state and non-state actors. That's why we've designated it one of the UK's 13 critical national infrastructure sectors, particularly because we do need to be aware of this risk and the need to protect our space infrastructure from both those man-made hazards but also natural hazards. Because if we get this wrong, for example, if you have an interruption to PNT, that's assessed as costing the UK £1 billion per day. So when in the Cabinet Office we're looking at the sort of threats, risks, hazards that we need to be guarding against, ensuring that we have effective space infrastructure is critically important. So that's why, as everyone on this panel will know, the Skidmore report of July of this year recommended the establishment of a National Space Council to cohere and coordinate space activity better across government and deliver the national space framework. There is agreement for that in principle, and we're determined to get on and deliver that. Obviously, we have had a few things going on in terms of how the resources of the Cabinet Office are being used at this juncture until the end of October, but it's certainly something that we're determined to press ahead with and deliver shortly. And the framework is really being expected to deliver and reflect on three pillars of national strategy: influence, prosperity, security, and defence. And the idea is that industry and academia will be integrated in this framework to the greatest extent possible. And I think if we get this right, I said that it's worth approximately 14.8 billion. I think we could get as far as it being worth 350 billion pounds. That's what it's worth globally at the moment. By 2040, some estimates say it could be worth as much as $1 trillion. So if we could just say capture 10% of that space market, that is a huge emergent market for the United Kingdom to be part of. And we're already quite a long way along the route to it. And we produce 40% of all small satellites. We have got this ongoing debate that many of you will be familiar with, and ministers are constantly being lobbied by the respective members of Parliament about where we should locate our spaceports. We've sort of got an internal competition alongside the external competition with other sites around the world, but we're currently advancing 3 spaceports in Wales, Cornwall and Scotland. And we're working, for example, with Virgin Orbital in respect of that. And the MOD is also investing $6 billion in Skynet 6, which is the next generation of satellite communications technology. So all in all, it feels to me as if we have got lots of different moving parts. We're starting from quite a high base already. We've got a clear ambition. And I think the role of the Cabinet Office is to try and work across all these different streams, both different government departments and the private sector, to make sure this coheres into an area where the UK takes advantage of this initial lead and sustains that and ensures that it is a sector where the UK is globally well represented in the decades ahead. And I'm confident we've got all the pieces in place. And my job as a minister, and the job of other ministers, is to work to smooth out the sort of friction between different departments and different players to ensure that coheres into development of the sector in the years ahead.
Thank you very much. Ian Taylor.
Well, that was a very comprehensive overview of some of the challenges facing the space sector. I was space minister, if you like, in the mid-1990s under then Conservative government, and David Willetts is one of my esteemed successors. But space in those days was very heavily driven by state organisations, and now it's become very diverse, with the private sector being encouraged. And, of course, it's become much more dependent on downstream information coming through both to government and the private sector to enable them to function. So one of the key things I picked up from Oliver's comments is that not only do we now increasingly have the benefit of space-derived services and data, but it becomes absolutely essential that we protect them. Protect them in terms of resilience, protect them in terms of assets against attack, which could be a cyber attack, or could be state-owned interference, or it could, of course, be natural attacks through solar winds which affect the magnetosphere and ionosphere. So there are all sorts of ways government has a role to protect the assets on which we increasingly depend. And another point that came out from Oliver's opening remarks is how dependent we are in terms of critical national infrastructure on many of the observations from space, the services from space. We need to be very careful in the future that we protect our interest in Copernicus, which actually, rather interestingly, originally was called the Global Monitoring for the Environment and Security. It's now called Copernicus, and of course that is procured by the European Space Agency, which we'll stay members of, but actually it's owned in an operational sense and paid for by the European Commission, where we're in difficulty. And space-derived environmental monitoring is going to be critical to us. And also the building of the satellites. We need to know that we've got access to the construction in the next wave of satellites for Copernicus. But what I'm advising Inmarsat on at the moment is the potential alternative system to Galileo, which we, because of Brexit, have decided that we're going to exclude ourselves from, or be excluded from, because we won't have full access to the secure public regulated service encryption. And actually this is pretty critical, because global navigation is, by what it sounds like, something which you use every day, and we have the American system and the emerging Galileo system. But actually, that's the easy bit. And the MOD in the past used to pretend it was always the Department of Transport, Oliver, that had the responsibility and budget line for some of the Galileo early days. But actually, the national grid depends on critical timing through the atomic clock and Galileo at the moment, and GPS. Financial transactions have to be date stamped. I mean, all of these critical industries, the National Health Service depends upon it. So Britain actually can't not have its own system. It's capable of being delivered. It needs to be managed. If the cost of an interruption to GPS or a degradation of signal or Galileo is 1 billion a day, then actually I won't say it's self-financing, but the cost over time of 3 to 5 billion is achievable. And Inmarsat is working with a whole cluster of UK organisations to strengthen the space sector as a whole in terms of the delivery of the project. Inmarsat is the largest operator of satellites in the world, 13, and it's British-based, of course. And it works already with the Department of Defence in America and of course, with the UK, including on the Skynet MOD programme. But by bringing in universities like Leicester and University College London, the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, the National Physical Laboratory, which has got critical expertise in the atomic clock, the Defence Science Technology Laboratory, which actually had a waveform patent which is licensed to the Americans and Galileo. It's still a British patent, although it's actually licensed out. But we're trusted partners here. And if we can activate the space sector using a lead prime contractor such as Inmarsat, then this project is capable of being delivered, hugely benefiting the UK industrial strategy, the skills, the innovation that's going to be required, but crucially actually enabling us to protect our critical national infrastructure, enable us to really push forward in what is going to be a data-driven space environment. Elements of 5G communications, Internet of Things, all of these things actually do depend on the sort of services that connect back to GNSS and the timing mechanisms and navigation that are involved in this project. So I think it's very exciting. It's a challenge. It needs to have not only the National Space Council, but a government major projects portfolio concern, and it just needs to be cross-departmental. At the moment, I think ministers are fighting not to have it on their budget line. So, Oliver, I'm not going to impose it on you. But David
We
Willetts,
have no money in the cabinet
Willetts and I
office.
negotiated with the Treasury for space budgets for long enough to know that every other government department thinks space is solely the concern of what is now called BAYS. It isn't. The Environment Department, the Health Department, the Home Office, the Cabinet Office, obviously, the Ministry of Defence, National Security, all of those are dependent on a system, and we want Britain to actually make sure that we not only build it now, but lead the world in showing what new innovation can do to make this system even better than those that currently exist.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian. And exactly this problem of departments in a way passing the cat from one to the other is why we need the National Space Council very much to provide that coordinating function. But what you mentioned about satellite data and the downstream applications of satellite capabilities, I mean, that leads us very, very nicely to Lucy Edge and the Satellite Applications Catapult.
Thank you. So the Catapults was set up about 7 years ago by government to help bridge the gap between R&D and economic growth. So I will talk a little bit more about the economic growth side of the space industry. The Satellite Applications Catapult specifically exists to try and help grow the economy through the growth of the space industry, but also through the uses of the space industry. And that means there needs to be a greater understanding of how space-enabled solutions work and a greater uptake of the use of space-enabled solutions. And the space industry, as you're hearing already, it's a great success story in this country. We put our minds to it about 10 years ago, and it's really been a great growth area. But the world does keep moving, and we do need to move with it. And there are some steps that we need to be taking now that if we don't take them, we get behind other countries that also see the immense value to space that we're talking about on this panel today. I think the National Space Council is a brilliant start. It needs to be backed by investment in order for it to have real benefit. We've talked about spaceports. We've agreed in the UK we are going to have spaceports, and now we need to make them a success. And that means we need to create a strong supply chain to support those spaceports within the UK, and also stimulate a strong pipeline of satellites to be launched from those spaceports in order for them to be sensible business cases. So the Satellite Applications Catapult has specifically been working in this area around a concept called disruptive innovation for space. And that is facilities that allows SMEs and startups to come and test out, prototype and start small-scale manufacture of some of their products without that big capital outlay that is often required in the space industry. So it allows innovative companies to bring their products to market faster. And we are having a lot of attention around the disruptive innovation for space concept. And the really good thing is that it can have a regional focus. So areas all around the country have places that have either been decommissioned or have been used for other things in the past, or are linked into where the spaceport infrastructure is, and they're saying, we can do this here. We've got the right capabilities, we've got the right organisations, we've got the will in our region to build on to this disruptive innovation for space concept, which then allows these startups and SMEs to push through the supply chain and create a really national capability behind the spaceport concept. Similarly, in Earth observation, you've heard and you know, I'm sure, that we are leaders in small satellites. And the satellites that have already been launched are creating incredible data sets that show us images of the Earth in all different wavelengths and allow us to help address some of the trickiest problems we are currently facing, whether we're talking about world issues like climate change or UK issues around healthcare and transport, or Brexit-related issues to do with agriculture or fisheries. The use of Earth observation data can help a space-enabled solution to really solve or at least address some of these really complicated problems. But we're not at that point yet where organisations and businesses and innovative startups are finding their way to that data to create those concepts and create those businesses. So if you think about 10 years ago and navigation data, and when people were starting to look at what businesses they could create off the back of location information, we had to go through a process of helping people to understand that that information was there, finding that killer opportunity that broke industry into the area of building businesses off the back of location data. Now all of our phones have got hundreds of those apps on them every day. More and more are being created. So what I would like to see is us being able to, in the UK, lead the way in creating that link through to Earth imagery data in the same way as has happened with navigation data, so that that innovation can occur, that economic growth can occur, and we can start solving some really, really difficult problems. And when we get to that point, we will have cracked it, but we're not there yet.
Thank you very much. And we move on to Lord Willetts, former Minister for Universities and Science, and was in charge of space under the coalition government, one of the probably the greatest reformer of UK space until now. So, Lord Willetts.
Well, thank you very much. And I apologise for arriving late and missing Oliver's brilliant presentation.
So you can be sure it was brilliant.
And I apologise therefore if I anything I say repeats what was said earlier. I was chairing another fringe which delayed me. It is an incredibly exciting time in UK space, and the fact that Policy Exchange has had this really excellent initiative of creating a particular focus on space policy is just another example of what a lively time it is. And although I don't believe in autarky and every country doing it on its own, the fact is that there is now a very attractive and coherent story of a UK capability with a UK launch facility, with UK obviously strong in the particular areas like small satellites, actually declare an interest on the board of Surrey Satellites, and with quite an exciting network of new companies developing innovative rockets to be launched from our capability. So that is all very good. Just a few kind of pointers and warnings. First of all, as I know from my experience, quite a few announcements, if you look at the small print of government policy, are subject to business case. And the subject to business case feature in a large amount of our innovation and space activity has proved to be quite a significant obstacle. And looking across, it's fantastic. We've got Oliver here from the Cabinet Office. The process whereby the subject to business case agreement actually happens is quite a significant impediment. And there are players who think there are announcements that the government has made where actually getting it out of the Treasury with the business case agreed adds many months to the process, and this is a fast-moving industry. I would say, secondly, in terms of kind of issues coming up urgently, we have got the ESA Ministerial. I don't know if Ian or others have touched on the ESA Ministerial, but Brexit is quite a challenge for ESA. The good news is that ESA is an intergovernmental body. It's the European Space Agency. It is not part of the EU. Intergovernmental bodies, if anything, will matter to us even more in a post-Brexit environment. That's the good news. The bad news is that, first of all, there are some ministers, and I'm sure Oliver isn't one of them, for whom the very fact it's got Europe in the title means that an alarm bell starts ringing, and they get worried about what is this dangerous European body. It's a completely intergovernmental body and not part of the EU. However, it has had historically a close relationship with the EU. It has in reality been the R&D arm of the EU when it comes to space. And something that it took me a while to get my head around, but once I had get my head around, I realised it was crucial for the Treasury, is that the way we have played the system is that ESA, as an intergovernmental body, operates on juste retour. When you turn up at the ESA ministerial, if you put in 25% of the money or 50% of the money for an ESA program on telecoms or Earth observation, you will basically get 25% or 50% of the industrial business activity as a result. If that prototype works and it then becomes an EU program, instead of reopening it all and having EU competitive tendering, you actually get your juste retour in the entire EU program. So to take it on a schematic example, if one satellite has worked and they buy another, and the EU then buys 20, and the Brits have put in for 25% of the original satellite, we then get 25% of the business for everything else. So it's has been historically a very good deal for us, which we have played quite skillfully. I'm not sure that in a Brexit environment where the first time you have a major player in ESA that is not part of the EU, I'm not sure how well that will operate for us in the future. And I think I'm not privy to where the conversations are going, and I'm sure they've not been resolved, but I think the EU-ESA relationship which was becoming quite fraught, is going to be destabilised by Brexit. And how we handle the ESA ministerial, and I very much hope we have a very significant role to play there, will be crucial. Just a couple of other observations. I think the Space Council is an excellent idea, and the crucial shift in thinking, which again is another great opportunity for us, is that the MOD's approach, strategic approach, has been completely transformed in the past few years. Basically, the MOD in the old days used to look to America. And for them, they didn't really expect to have much UK autonomous capability, because anything we really wanted, we asked the Americans for it, and they provided it. And hence we ended up in the extraordinary position where Nigeria has an autonomous capability to observe the UK, and the UK does not have an autonomous capability to observe Nigeria. You know, we had to ask the Americans very nicely before there would be an operation, if there were ever an operation on the borders of Nigeria, please could you send us some imagery that we could use, or buy it off Google, literally buy it off Google, access off of Google. I think the MOD has now changed and wants their own, realise that as well as comms they need an EO capability, and that means that they've become players at the part of the table in a council that brings together the civil and the military, is a really useful initiative. But it remains the case, and this is the future role for the council, it's very hard, as Ian said, to get departments that are users of space data and imagery, often without the ministers, without even being aware of it, ever to commit to prepay and purchase it. So I don't know how much overall across Whitehall is spent on getting data from space. I suspect quite a lot. But I never was able, I remember when we did Novasat, for example, synthetic aperture radar, I remember trying to get some other, before I went and negotiated with the Treasury, trying to get some other department saying, if we build this thing, you will wish to use it. Will you possibly put some money in to pre-commit? This is how they drive innovation in the US that we're talking about. Will you pre-commit a bit of money? Nobody else would pre-commit the money, so you have to put in all the money. And then exactly as I expected, we've now got the MOD using Novasat, but they were not willing to put any money in initially to get it launched. So what you've got is a massively diverse budget, a random expenditure on getting services that you need from space, and no capacity for the government as a whole to look at its overall need, as a result of which you'd actually find that a fully autonomous capability was financially viable. And I think that's an area to tackle. And then finally, just picking up, Oliver and I were at a dinner last night where we were having a fascinating discussion about technology and the capacity that we had to look ahead, do foresight exercises on the development of technology. And of course, it's a rapidly moving area and nobody can predict everything. But in reality, you can make an informed assessment of how technology is developing, which are the hot areas where, looking ahead 5 or 10 years, you can see that the UK has got a strong R&D capability, where there's a global business opportunity, where we have a comparative advantage. That applies at the macro scale, but it also applies within particular areas. And we've got this really exciting 2.4% of R&D target commitment made by the Chancellor, which is a mixture of public spend and private spend. And when I look at how we promoted the combination of public and private spend in space, the device of the technology roadmap was incredibly helpful. And what you do is you get both the public people within the public sector, but also in the business community, to try to sit around a table and just define where the UK Space Agency is spending its money on technological developments, where in broad terms the commercial players are spending their money on technological developments, areas of technology that they think is significant but which neither side is funding, areas where you find an overlap. And when you do it, again, you're not claiming 100% foresight, but if you do a technology roadmap like that, looking 5 years ahead, and some budgets are pre-committed, you can see from that, hang on, if the UK Space Agency put in 10 million and the business community put in 10 million, this key bit of kit would suddenly fit into the puzzle. And we got a couple of technology roadmaps in my time. We got Keith O'Nien's, for example, ex-Imperial and ex-Chief Scientist at MOD, coordinated a very useful exercise. I don't believe, I'm open to correction, I don't believe there's currently a technology roadmap exercise underway within the space community. And so, as well as going back to the horizon scanning technology foresight exercise as a whole, within key areas such as space, where we already have public spend and private spend, I think an updated technology roadmap would be a really useful initiative.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much. So a lot of things in there to unpack, but our main mission now is to just drill down on two specific topics: the National Space Council and the GNSS, the Global Navigation Satellite System that we hope Britain will build to compensate for Galileo. So first of all, I would just want to say that we hear very good things about the space sector and all the potential that Britain has, but we should also, in fairness, say that certainly on civil space, Britain spends very little comparatively to many other countries. So there are at least 9 other countries in the world which spend more than £1 billion equivalent on space. We spend 400. That is roughly the budget of the UK Space Agency. We don't currently have any sovereign space capability apart from Skynet 5, which is a PFI to begin with. So in this global space race that we're talking about, Britain has very strong potential in terms of innovation, technology, skills, and the technology and science base. But we need to also sort of be mindful of the challenge ahead of us, the global competition, both in commercial terms, but also in security and defense terms. And you see many other countries taking this very seriously, starting with what the Americans are doing with the Space Force. The French are, they will be spending 2.6 billion euros within the next 5 years only on military space capabilities. And the budget of the French Space Agency is, more than 2 billion euros per year. So, there is a big gap between what we're doing in terms of the resources that we're putting into this and what's happening across the world. And we hope that the National Space Council will sort of help drive a new approach that sees space as a more sort of strategic and component of the national interest for Britain. And one important feature of the Space Council obviously will be where and how it will be established. I mean, will it be perhaps a cabinet level committee? Will it have a secretariat in the cabinet office, for example, on the model of the National Security Council? Because we do need that coordination across departments. And we do need to bring the defense and civil space policies together, because technically we actually have two separate space policies in this country. Other countries, for example, France, right? I mean, they work military and civil, they work hand in glove. So yes, how is this starting to look like?
Is that aimed at me?
Yes.
So there's quite a few issues you raised there, and some touch upon the comments others made, particularly David. I think, for me, the starting point is the fundamentals are in a pretty good place for us for a number of reasons. First of all, as David said, there is a clear commitment from the government to science and technology. I know that the Prime Minister personally believes in this spending. This is something that you may remember Chancellor George Osborne announced. He was very much sold on the need for investment in science and tech, announced his 2.4% target. Often when you have a change of Prime Minister, targets get junked, there's sort of, some things become more or less important. I think you've seen from the Chancellor, and I know from discussing this with the Prime Minister and those around him, he has got a personal commitment to this. So I think you can be pretty sure that the 2.4% target remains very much government policy. Secondly, the PM is very much, and the government is very much seized of the need to invest in infrastructure. And it strikes me that this is a sort of perfect tying in of infrastructure and science and technology. So I think there's every reason, if you don't trust me, to look at the wider picture to believe that there is genuine political will behind this and a real potential for this to happen. Now, clearly, with anything that happens in government, things don't happen overnight. But what I would observe is that the building blocks are getting in place. So we had the Skidmore report. We have had a clear commitment in principle to developing the National Space Council. As I said, the Cabinet Office has an interest in this because it cuts across different government departments. So there's a clear coordinating role there. I can't commit to the creation of cabinet committees. That is something that the Prime Minister does on the advice of the Cabinet Secretary. But I think there's certainly there's a strong argument for doing it, if not at a cabinet committee level, at something that has equivalent cross-government convening powers. I mean, on the specifics of cabinet committees, the Prime Minister announced the initial set of cabinet committees a few weeks ago. I doubt those will change ahead of the 31st of October, but I think there's the will. We're making progress, and I'm quite sure that we will get the structures in place to achieve that. And I think it's a very important point about tying up defence and civil. And I think you mentioned the National Security Council. We are getting better in government at tying up different bits of government activity into a cohesive view, whether that's in relation to national security, but we've done a similar thing in relation to how we approach government procurement, how we approach government property. So I think it's all in line with that that overall approach taken by government. I very much take on board David's points about business case and so on. My job as a minister, and I do it pretty much every day, is to have those fights with the Treasury, try and cajole other departments to try and get that combined view. So I think we can do it, and I'm actually pretty optimistic that we will make good progress in this area.
Thank you very much. Ian, you wanted to...
Well, I just want to sort of underline the challenge, which is in no way trying to diminish what Oliver has just been saying about commitment, because I think the commitment is there politically. So let's accept there is a political commitment. The 2.4% is a worry. Not because there shouldn't be a target of 2.4%, but it's actually quite important to remember that government spend on R&D is about 0.7% of GDP, which means that the balance up to the current level of 1.7% is private. So if the private sector does not increase its investment, then the government, to get to 2.4%, has to double what it's currently doing. It's just worth us analysing a little bit that challenge. Because when you hear a minister, and Chris Skidmore's an excellent minister, but when you hear him talking about the 2.4% challenge, he's really talking about what he hopes the private sector is going to be doing to make more commitment. And actually the way that you should challenge ministers on this, because like so long ago that I was a minister that I'm very happy you should challenge ministers nowadays, is to say, well, what percentage of that 2.4% is going to be government spend? Mm. And then you get, obviously, probably silence or a partial answer. But this is crucial to the infrastructure elements and the global navigation projects and all the other things. Government has to realise that this is a cross-government departmental interest. That's why the National Space Council is important, and it doesn't all come out of one departmental budget, because my final point, listen to a minister talking about projects which actually cover more than one government department. You will find quite often that they won't mention a project which they are anxious not to have put back onto their budget. David and I know these sort of little things. So it's what's not in a minister's speech that's important, and find out what it is and then challenge.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know if anyone else has a comment on.
Well, I could comment on a new example that we're involved with at the moment. There's a project coming out of DSTL called Serapis, and that's a really interesting concept, because that's a ring-fence set of funds coming from DSTL. It's working with primes in the private sector. It's split up into chunks, but there's a few $100 million there. And there is a target within that project for working with SMEs. And the reason I mention it in this context is I think it's an interesting model for how you can start to get that R&D flowing through from some of the smaller, more innovative companies that can move a bit more rapidly. It's a new project. It remains to be seen whether it's successful or not. But I think it's a really interesting concept where you set yourself targets to seek out those R&D projects right from the start.
Yeah, just to clarify, the STL is MOD's R&D agency. Yeah. So this is potentially a good sign of the MOD opening up a bit more towards working across industry, a bit more on space, which yeah, that would be a welcome change. Willetts, I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, I think we've got some fantastic experts here in the hall. I think it'd be very good to hear from them.
Perhaps on GNSS now. How do we? So first of all, we've established the requirement. I mean, and the need for GNSS. Everybody is quite clear on that. But how do we actually deliver this project? And how do we ensure that we have a pan-industry approach to GNSS that harnesses all the talents and specialisms across industry?
That is a very important question. I mean, well, I mean there are several delicate issues. I think that there's one crucial strategic choice is you can go for a quick, dirty option, which is basically something that looks quite like Galileo. Galileo is going relatively slowly and aim to get something up and functioning fast that is relatively simple and straightforward. At the other extreme, you see this as a fantastic opportunity to generate lots of new British technology in something that is significantly different from current offerings. You use it to promote new technology providers. You design it from scratch, and you get something that takes rather longer and costs more. And my impression is that having started with Plan A, we're heading towards Plan B. That's one issue. I think a second issue is who is the holder of the budget, and it begins with the MOD, but the MOD don't really want to hold the budget for fear that the Treasury will say, we'll do a 50-50 deal with you guys, you've got to find 50% out of your own budget, exactly as Ian was saying earlier. And so the MOD are kind of stepping back a bit, and it will end up being a Cabinet Office-led kind of procurement exercise, and there are... it's excellent. We might have Oliver in charge of it, but it is going to be, that is quite a challenge. That is the second issue. And the third issue is what the market is, and the hope was that the US would regard it as their reserve system, as their contingency if GPS is, because GPS itself is vulnerable. It is not so clear that the Americans would regard the UK project as sufficiently different to be accepted by them as a resilient backup system. My understanding from conversations with them is they're looking for a backup system that is rather more different from GPS than our system is likely to be. And if you're not selling it to the US as partners, as their backup system, that significantly changes the economics of it. So you look to the obvious grown-up countries that don't have a full access to a global system, and you get Japan, which has got a regional but not a full system, and Australia, and you then start negotiations with Japan and Australia, and they want to contribute to the project, so it becomes more complicated as you try to work out what the contributions are from those countries. So I think it's looking quite complex at the moment, and I'm sure that between them, this think tank and the Cabinet Office are going to resolve those issues.
That's exactly what we'll do. But before we resolve the issues, we'll take some questions from the audience. So it's open for questions. We've got one over there, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of others coming up.
Thank you, Philip Rattley, Leonardo. I've just reread Ben Wallace's speech on Skynet 6 3 weeks ago today. I realise 3 weeks is a long time in the current British political environment, but nonetheless, he makes no reference to any of the issues that have been discussed by the panel. Is that because the MOD wrote the speech and gave it to a new minister who really didn't understand which way was up? Or were they exercising their normal prerogative of very skillfully avoiding the rest of government and making sure that they will have nothing whatsoever to do with anyone else's initiative?
I think that's possibly more rhetorical than demanding an answer. I sadly did not read that particular speech by the Defence Secretary. I would imagine he was talking about the specific MOD-owned capabilities, which is clearly Skynet 6. I don't think one should read too much into the MOD's position on the wider projects. Clearly what David and others have spoken about, and you were alluding to, is a challenge with every project that cuts across more than one government department, that there will be this passing... Well, not passing the buck. There's a concern that if one government department owns it in exactly the way that David described, that they will end up taking more than their proportion of the budget and end up having to broker with other departments to get the cash for it. They'd far rather that the Treasury did the brokering and it was owned somewhere else. But that's not unique to a cross-government project. That's exactly the conversations we have to deal with every cross-government project, and we're well used to doing it. So it is one of the many challenges that needs to be overcome, and David very eloquently listed a number of the other challenges that we need to work through. I don't see that any of those are things that will prevent this going ahead. There are things that we need to work through which are perfectly normal in the course of cross-departmental collaboration.
Thank you very much.
Can I just make a quick point in that? We won't really make any progress until government departments see themselves as an anchor tenant, a first buyer of the eventual service. And culturally, that's very difficult. But that is the only really way forward, and as David alluded, that's the way the Americans work. They say, we want this service, who out there is prepared to do it? We're prepared to pre-commit. Against this contract, you can then borrow private. I mean, we are so antiquated in the way we think through infrastructure projects and then how we manage them as well.
That's a very good point, because we look at SpaceX, great successful private company, and sometimes we think, well, why should the government do this? You can have a private company. But that's not true. I mean, SpaceX grew on the back of massive U.S. government orders on that model. So, I mean, there is no sort of magic here that you can apply without actually putting in the resources. So let's have another question here in the front.
Thank you. James Kemmel from Inmarsat. Lord Willetts used the word autarky in your opening comments, and I'd like to open up, get the panel's perspective on the international dimension here as well. A couple of weeks ago, or last week in fact, there was the UK Space Conference in Wales that had 3 ministers attending from DIT, from BEIS, and from the MOD. Aside from the UK contingent, there was also 10 international delegations who attended at very, very senior levels. Vice Chair of the Chinese Space Agency, Director of the Indians, Chief Executive of the Australians, directors from the Japanese Space Agency, etc. And I think it's important that we recognise that what the UK is doing, 3 ministers, National Space Council, etc., is very important. Our competitor or partner countries are doing the same with the same level of vigour and verve. And I'd be interested in how we might take forward an audit of the UK's soft power and international relations in space, identifying those assets and making sure that they serve the UK Global Britain agenda through, for example, the Skynet, the GNSS, or the National Space Council type activities.
Thank you. Anyone wants to...
Lucy?
I think, I completely agree. I mean, it is a combination of competitor and collaboration, of course, and I think collaboration is definitely an important part of what we do in the space industry. By its nature, it doesn't really have any borders, and that's a good thing. The way that we are working in the UK at the moment, and the feedback we are getting from the small companies, the startups, and the companies that are relocating to the UK, is that this is a place to work where they can't do some of the things, where they can do some of the other things that they can't do in other countries, partly because of the infrastructure that's available to them, partly because of the very successful space cluster that's developed around Harwell, partly because of the way the regulations are developing to help some of the new space activities. And I think it's important that we find great partnerships. It's important that we work internationally, but it's also very important that we continue to keep moving forward what we offer in the UK across the space sector, so it continues to be really attractive for the inward movement. And what I would say on the GNSS programme, rather than talking about it from a political angle, I think it is an enormous opportunity to have a really impressive flagship project, something that makes the UK stand out for innovation, for new space technologies, for doing things differently, which will not only give us a lot of credibility, but it also makes us very interesting for skills and people from across the world who would want to look across the space industry and say, where do I want to go? Where do I want to work? Where are the interesting things happening? And so I think, every time we look at something big like GNSS, we need to be looking at it in the context of how are other people going to view us if we decide to take this forward.
And there's one other quick point. We are trusted, by and large, as a nation, and particularly our industrial base is trusted. And GNSS is very sensitive to political concerns. The Americans already have more than once threatened to degrade signals, not to us as it happens, but to the French, for example. We, as a nation, don't want to be dependent on other people degrading a signal to us in whatever way, because actually this will cause catastrophic failure of many of our critical national infrastructures. And other countries look to us. And so if we have an alternative system, the possibility of improving international relations with certain countries and also exports is very, very considerable. So another government department that should put money into this, the Department of International Trade.
I mean, Ian's absolutely right. The origins of Galileo are supposed to be a meeting in Brussels in the 1990s when a European minister asked the American general in charge of GPS, because it still remains ultimately a military project, will you commit that whatever circumstances, the GPS signal will remain available to us, to which the American general replied, no comment.
Correct.
And that is why people realised they needed an autonomous capability. I think you're absolutely right, James, on the kind of soft power issue. I think, again, and it's fantastic that Oliver is here, because one of the roles of the Cabinet Office, which he absolutely pursues, is being the kind of progress chaser and making sure that things that have been committed happen. And I do think that an issue behind what you're talking about is the export control regime. We clearly need to have an export control regime because some of this stuff is very sensitive. I think it would help a lot of the players that we're trying to bring in if the kind of guidelines for export controls were as explicit as possible, and if the decisions on export control could be taken rapidly. And sometimes there's a diplomatic cost if people who've done a contract, if it's left hanging for too long, and it can become a fraught issue in relationships with potential partner countries. So making sure that export control operates with as much clarity as possible and as promptly as possible would really help.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. Take one there.
Morning, everyone. Chris McLaughlin, now of OneWeb Satellite, and formerly for 14 years at Inmarsat to declare my links with David and Ian and indeed James. You touched on the really important bit, which is regulatory environment. The real key, if I look from OneWeb, we're launching 650 satellites. We're starting at Christmas with the first 30-odd. Boris asked me yesterday, so Chris, is it going to be going from Cornwall? And I said, not this time, but maybe next time. Well, I really think it should be going already. So he's got the bug. But the issue is this. We will need launch licenses. As it stands at the moment, the civil service is saying, well, we'd like you to do some launches, and then we'll have a look at how they're doing, and then we'll let you know whether we think you've done them very well, and then we'll let you know if you can launch another 30. This is a 3.4 billion business backed by SoftBank that has chosen the United Kingdom. We won't be in the United Kingdom if we end up with regulatory freeze like that. So please, would you look at how we can encourage them to behave like the Americans, who've simply given SpaceX a blank check to launch as many as they like, as often as they like, failing as many as they like, which we won't do because it's Airbus. But we've got to change our mindset.
Thank you. Clearly that question hit home, but if anyone has any comments on that, that would be...
Well, all I can say is that as Cabinet Office Minister, one of the annoyances to my colleagues across government is that we do have licence to delve into what other departments are doing and chase up things that are not quite working. And I won't comment either way because I don't know the detail of it, but I am very happy to chase up both the point about the export control regime and the launch license to make sure we are in the right place on that. And I think those are exactly the reasons why we need to have a sort of coordinating committee so that the committee can consider these things on an ongoing basis. And certainly when we have these coordinating committees, that's exactly the purpose of it. Each month or whenever it sits on the agenda are those areas where there are blockages, and we get all the ministers around the room, and they don't really make the decision in the room because all their officials have prepared the papers before, but it proves to be an unblocking mechanism, and that is the purpose of creating a cross-government working group.
Thank you very much, and I think we are out of time, unfortunately, so we'll bring this to a close. Obviously, there are a lot of things on the agenda. There are very good noises from the government on all these major issues, the Space Council, GNSS, and so on, but we do need them to progress quickly, because space is changing very fast, and we do risk being left behind. So while the UK has a great potential in this area, if we don't act fast, we won't be able to win very easily in this race. So thank you all very much for coming, and yes.
Thank you.